So you're working on your adventure games for Intro to Programming, and they're stepped out over these milestones. And your adventure games are these choose your own adventure games. So the key part of that is that there are a lot of choices in the game, and choosing things is fundamental to the interaction of the game. So I want to show you a cool way to create a menu system that makes your menus a little bit more interesting. And so this will also let us practice some of our new documentation reading skills. So it'll look something like this, where we can display a main menu and we can go ahead and choose an option, like maybe we want to play the game, and we can use that menu a second time to do something else. Like every time we present an option to the player, we can use this menu system to make it so that they don't have to type a number to choose an option or press 1, 2, or 3 to choose an option. They can just use the arrow keys and then hit enter. And this is really classic stuff. So any controller-based game is going to have a menu system like this, where you can use your controller to navigate around that menu, choose different options. Like here, someone is playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake and choosing their difficulty settings from their main menu. So let's look at the final version and kind of talk about what we're maybe going to need to be able to make this work. I'm going to start the game over. So what are we going to need to be able to make this menu? We need to be able to figure out which key has been pressed. So previously, when we detected keys that have been pressed, we've just said, has any key been pressed? Or we've said, give me a whole line of text that the player has entered. But in this case, we just need a single key, and we need to know which one it is. So if it's the down arrow, we need to move the selected option down and display credits here as selected. And if the up arrow is pressed, we need to move the selection up. And then if the enter key is pressed, we need to go to the next screen and exit the menu. So we're going to use console in a different way, so it's helpful to diagram this out. I'm going to flip over to a whiteboard here. So our console applications in the past, we've kind of had this structure where we draw some text to the screen, maybe we ask the player to type something in, we draw some more text, and eventually maybe a scroll bar would show up as we're accumulating text on the screen. We're not going to do that. We're going to do a different structure. So we are going to draw our menu. We're going to have some kind of like prompt, or in this case, it's the title of our game being displayed. Then we will display those options: play, about, exit. And we'll do something special to whichever option is currently selected. In this case, I'm going to draw a little caret next to the play to indicate that that one's selected. So this is what we draw the first time, and then when the player presses an arrow key, we're going to throw that out and draw it from scratch. This time when we draw about, we're going to have the arrow key next to about. And so we'd continue with this structure. If the player presses the arrow key again, we're going to clear the whole screen, we're going to redraw the menu, and then we're going to put the caret next to exit. And when they press enter, we will go ahead and close down the menu, and we'll know that exit was selected because that's the last place we drew the caret. So we're going to be redrawing this menu a number of times, so that means that we need to have some kind of data structure that allows us to redraw it multiple times. So let's focus in on these options that we're displaying. And we're going to be displaying any number, in this case 3, and they're going to be strings that we're drawing to the screen. And we want to have some way to draw them one at a time. So that should hopefully lead you to thinking about having an array. So we can have string options equals, in this case, we're going to have play, about, exit. And so we can loop through this, and we can display play, and then on the next iteration of the loop display about, and on the next iteration of the loop display exit. So we've got kind of half of what we need. The other half is we need to know which is selected. So when we went ahead and drew it the first time, we knew play was the selected element. So we could draw the caret next to play and keep track of the fact that play is selected, so that if we hit enter, we know we should play the game. And if we press the down arrow, we now need to keep track of the fact that about is selected. And same logic, if they press the arrow key again, we need to keep track of exit is selected. So with an array or a list, one easy way to keep track of where we are is using an index. So we can say int selected index, and when it starts, it'll be 0, and then when they press the down arrow key, we will change that selected index to 1 to indicate that about is now selected, and if they press it again, change it to 2 to indicate that exit is now selected. So those are the components that we're going to need. So let's go ahead and spin up a new project and start working on it. So I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to make sure it's .NET Core, and I'm going to put this into my class folder. I will call it keyboard menu demo. And just to get started, I want to create a couple of classes to skeleton out what we're going to have. So we've got program, that's always going to be in our console-based applications. It has our entry point, but we want to keep this clean. So we're going to go ahead and create, since we're making a game, let's create a game class. And the other class that we're going to want to create ahead of time is this menu class. So let's add a class and let's call it menu. We can flip back to the game class, and we're going to need some way for our game to play. So let's create a public void start method. Inside of our program, we can create a new game, call that public method we just created for starting the game. And to make sure that all of this skeleton works before we add new stuff, let's print something out to the console. And remember that if we don't do a read key, our application is just going to print the stuff out and then close immediately. So let's see if this works. There we go. Game is starting. Press any key to exit. We can close this down and we can start focusing in on the new content. So the first thing that we need to learn how to do is figure out which key has been pressed. We want some variable that we can store that tells us which key has been pressed so that we can use it in a conditional to say, well, if this variable was the up arrow, let's do this. And if this variable was the down arrow, then let's do this. So we know how to do read line, which allows us to check a string of characters from the player's input. And we know how to do read key, where we've used it just basically to control whether or not a key has been pressed. So in this case, our application will end if any key has been pressed. And so because you have now learned how to read the documentation really well, what I want you to do is pause the video at this point and see if you can figure out in the console documentation what we need to do to be able to get the key that has been pressed. So I'm going to trust that you've done that, you've paused the video, and I'm going to go through the process myself. So what I'm going to do is I want to look up this read key documentation. So I'm going to search for console.read key. I'm going to go to the console read key documentation, and I'm going to start looking through this and trying to parse out, do I see any examples that show how to read the key that has been pressed? Do I see any other useful information? So right off the bat, we can see that this method obtains the next character pressed by the user, and there are two overloads, and we learned about overloads last week, and an overload is just another version of the same name for a method, except that it accepts a different number of parameters. And so let's check out read key with the Boolean, and that Boolean is the intercept variable, which determines whether or not the key that has been pressed shows up in the console window. So if it's true, whatever gets pressed for read key doesn't actually get displayed to the window, which is exactly what we want for our menu system, because if we press the up and down arrow key, we don't want anything to be inserted into the console window, and if the player presses enter, we also don't want anything to be inserted in the window. So we want to capture that information, so we'll definitely keep track of that. We know we're going to want to intercept, And if I scroll back up and we start going through and look at some of the examples here. So maybe we don't know what all of this does. Like maybe we don't know what date.now is and local time zone. We recognize press enter to exit. And then we see this loop here. So it's doing something like it's doing console.read key, and whatever gets returned, it's accessing the key property and comparing it to make sure that it does not equal console key.enter. So essentially this is creating an empty loop that keeps running as long as the enter key hasn't been pressed. So even though we don't understand all of this code example, we can kind of pick out some pieces and be like, okay, well, we know that in order to figure out the next step, there is something returned from console.read key that we want to investigate. And there's also this thing called console key.enter that we should investigate. So let's start with console.read key. And if we look at either of the signatures for read key, this one or the overload, we can see that it also specifies what it returns. And it is this object that describes the console key that was pressed. So console key info. So we can click on that to check out the documentation there. It describes the console key that was pressed, including the character and any of the modifiers that were pressed when the key was pressed. We can scroll down. We can see another example that seems to be doing something like reading the key and then printing out what was actually pressed. And if we keep going down, we can start looking through the properties and methods. And if we look in the properties, here's that key property that we saw from our code snippet earlier from Microsoft. So I'm going to click on that. And the key property of console key info tells us that it gets the console key represented by that console key info object. And similar, we see the same example here. If we look at what type of variable that is, so that's specified here, it's something called console key. You can see the word console key here. So that's when we saw console key.enter. Oh, here we go. Here's console key. So we can click on that and look and see that it's something called an enum. So an enum is a special type of variable that only has a couple of predetermined values. And we've used it before with foreground color and background color. So console color is an enum as well. And if we scroll down here, we can see, oh, look, here's the D key. So we can say console key.d. And if we search for enter, we can see console key.enter. So it looks like we have all of the keys that could be pressed stored inside of this enum. So let's go back a little bit and head back to console.read key and the snippet that we were looking at before. So we know that this returns a console key info object, which has a key property that is a console key enum. And here we are comparing that console key enum against a specific value for the enter key. So we've kind of unpacked a little bit of how we can read a key in and check whether it's enter. So what we should probably do at this point is we've built up some knowledge from looking at the documentation. Let's test it out in our code. So I'm going to flip back to our example here. And let's try that out. So we saw that there was something called console key info that gets returned when you do a read key. So let's say the key pressed is equal to read key. And then let's go ahead and if key pressed dot key is equal to console key dot enter, right line, you pressed enter, else right line, you press another key. So if we run it now, we're doing read key like we've done before, but we're capturing what's returned by read key into this key pressed variable. And we're checking that key property against that key console enum. So if I go ahead and hit play, the game is starting. It's waiting for me to press a key. I'm going to press enter. It tells me that I pressed enter. Great. So let's see if we can detect one of the arrow keys here as well. So if key pressed dot key equals, and maybe we don't want to pull up the documentation again to see what were all the enum values. I can say console key dot, and then we can look through here and look, it's already auto-completed with a couple of suggestions that look like what we want. So it looks like we would say the direction and then the name arrow. So if I start typing left, we can see left arrow, or up arrow, right line, you pressed the up arrow. Let's try it out again. So let's run it. And if I press the up arrow, it prints out you press the up arrow. So it looks like we kind of have all we need in terms of the new code syntax for read key. What we now need to do is hook this logic up to a menu. Okay, so what we have here, what we can do is, let's just comment this part out. We'll save it here so that we can refer to it later, but we can eventually just delete that code. That code was just there so that we could figure out how to read console keys. And at this point, we can flip back over to our menu and we can start filling this out. So with our whiteboard, we figured we needed to keep track of what the selected index was. So when we display a menu, the menu needs to keep track of the selected index. And we also figured out that we needed to keep track of an array or list of strings that were the options for that menu. And I'm going to tack on here, what we also need is a prompt. So what gets displayed before the menu options are displayed. So in the case of our main menu, that would be the title, and then our options would be play, about, exit. But if this were like a shop in our game, the prompt might be, what do you want to buy? And then the options would be the 3 items that we have for sale. So we've got our fields for our menu. And then maybe let's move on to our constructor. So we're going to make a public constructor, and we're going to need to take in a value for the prompt and options here. So the string prompt and string options. And we want to go ahead and fill those in. So our prompt field is equal to what gets passed in as prompt, and our options array gets filled in with whatever gets passed in as the options. And we can set our selected index to 0. So we've got some fields. We've got a way to construct this menu. Let's add a way to be able to display the options that are in our menu. So let's create we'll make it public for the moment, and we're going to come back and make this private since this doesn't have to be public, but display options. And what we want to do here, this is the method that's going to be responsible for rendering the menu again to the screen. So every time we clear the screen and we redraw the menu, we're going to call this method. So we're going to need to print out that prompt. So this would be our title, or what do you want to buy? And then what we want to do, make sure we bring in using static system.console. What we want to do is loop over our options and print them out. So let's grab a trusty for loop. And we can pull out the current option from our options array using that index, that I variable. And we're eventually going to need to compare this against our selected index to see if the current option is selected. Then we're going to have to do something special to it to indicate to the player that it's selected. But let's just go ahead and print out the current option. And I'm just adding these as a little bit of design to make it look sort of like a button in the console so that it stands out from the rest of the text. Let's go ahead and test this out. So right now, if we were to create a menu and we were to call the display options, we should see the prompt print out, and then each of the options one at a time should print out on a new line. So back inside of game, we can create a new menu. So we can say menu, let's make it our main menu for our game. Main menu is equal to new menu. And here we're going to have to pass in those two things that we defined. So there needs to be some kind of prompt and then some kind of array of options. And let's break this out into a couple lines here to make it a little clearer. So our prompt is going to be something like, welcome to the paint drying simulator. What would you like to do? And then our array of options is going to be equal to our string, so play, about, and exit. So let's go ahead and pass those into our menu here. And then if we have set things up properly and we call the main menu's display options method, which we made public before, this should hopefully print out, welcome to the paint drying simulator, what would you like to do? And then give you those three options on the screen. Awesome. So this is working. We're getting there. What we need to do is modify our menu now so that we display one of these in kind of special styling so that we can tell which one is selected. So once we've been able to figure out how to display which one's selected, then we could move on to changing which one is selected using the arrow keys. So let's go back to our display options menu method here. So instead of just blindly drawing the current option, we kind of want to check, is the current option, the option that we're working on here, is that the selected index? If it is, let's draw it in a different style. And if it isn't, we'll draw it in the default style. So we want to do something like, if the current index, the one that we're looking at, is equal to the selected index, we'll do one thing. Otherwise, let's do something else. So let's add a prefix. So remember how I was drawing like a caret in our whiteboard diagram? We're going to put that here. So we're going to have a prefix that shows up before the option. And if it's the selected option, we'll go ahead and say the prefix is equal to, let's use an asterisk. And if it's not the selected option, we will make it an empty space. So already this should hopefully work. We set our selected index to 0, so we should hopefully see an asterisk next to the first option when we run this. So we've got an asterisk, and then we've got a blank space here and here so that we can keep everything lined up. Great. So let's go ahead and change the color. Foreground color is equal to console color.black. And the background color is equal to console color.white. And let's flip these around when it is normal text that isn't selected. And then at the end of our method here, we can go ahead and be kind and reset color so that if we display some color outside of this, or display some text outside of this, it goes back to the default colors and doesn't use whatever the last color we set in here was. So if we should run this now, we should see that we've kind of got a contrast reversal here. Whichever one is selected is going to be displayed in black text on a white background, and the others are displayed in white text on a black background. So let's see if our selected index actually works as we expected. If I come up here and we change our selected index to 1 manually and run it, now when we run it, we should see about is the first thing that shows up as selected. We can do the same thing for 2, which should hopefully select exit. So at this point, we got the skeleton set up. It's just now time for us to make it interactive. And instead of changing the selected index by hand, we want to change it when the player has pressed the arrow keys. Before we do that, let's clean up a bit. So I have manually changed the selected index. Let's set that back to 0 so that it always starts at the beginning of our options. let's make this method private, since the outside world doesn't ever really need to call this display options method. What we're going to do is create a new method called run. So this is going to be what the outside world calls, and instead of returning void, let's have it return an integer. So when you create a menu, you are going to call, instead of display options, run, and what you're going to get back is the selected index. So then when we run the menu, we'll be able to say, this will handle all of the arrow key movement up until someone presses enter. And then when someone presses enter, it's going to give us back the selected index. So if they left the play selected and hit enter, this will be 0. If they move down to about and selected that, this will be 1 and would be 2 for exit. So back in menu, what we need to do is implement our logic for actually returning that integer. Let's build this out in 2 steps. So one step is that we want to create this loop structure that every time the player presses a key, we go ahead and re-render our menu. And eventually it'll be the selected index will have changed, so we'll kind of be highlighting a different option. But for now, we'll create that structure so that we're looping, we're drawing the menu every time a key is pressed, and if the enter key is pressed, we can stop and we can go ahead and say return the selected index. So whatever the selected index is, we give that back and we say the menu's done running, here's what the player chose. So to set up this structure, let's create a console key variable called key pressed. And this is that enum that we saw earlier. And we're going to use a do while loop. And what we'll say is as long as the key pressed does not equal console key.enter, let's keep running this loop. And as soon as we hit enter, we can stop and return the selected index because we know the menu is done running. So now we could fill this out. So let's console key info equals read key. And so we saw before that if we do read key, we can get the console key info object, and then we know that the console key info object has a key property that we can then use. Here's where we would check, let's say update selected index based on arrow keys. We will fill that in, and we probably want to clear the screen and display the options. So if we run this right now, in our game, we created this menu. We are getting the selected index from main menu.run. So we should see things every time we press a key, clear, redraw the menu, and it should stop, and our menu should end, and our game should end if the player presses the enter key. So let's try that out. So pressing a bunch of random keys, it's re-rendering a bunch of times. I press enter, menu's done, press any key to exit, game closes. So we've got that first piece of the puzzle. We have this loop that's redrawing the menu every time a key is pressed. And now we can fill out this. So we want to update the selected index based on the arrow keys. So in game, selected index is 0, which means we're at play by default. If we press the down arrow, we want to go from the selected index of 0 to the selected index of 1. And if we press down again, to 2. So every time we press down, we want to go ahead and increase the selected index. And then if we are here, we're at 2 for the selected index, and we press the up arrow, we actually want to subtract and go closer to an index of 0, which would be the front of the array. So if the key pressed is equal to console key dot up arrow, we want to take the selected index closer to the front of the array. So selected index -1 or minus, else if the key pressed is equal to console key dot down arrow, we want to take the selected index higher and do selected index ++, or add 1 to the selected index each time. So before I run this, build up your expectations of what's going to happen. Is anything going to go wrong? Let's run it and find out. So I'm going to hit play. If I press the down arrow, woo, it works. If I press the up arrow, great. What happens if I press the up arrow here? It goes off the screen and nothing is selected. And I can hit down, again, go off the screen, nothing is selected, because now our selected index is 1 greater than the last index in our array. And if we were going up here, our selected index is 0, I press up, it went to -1. So there's no index in our array corresponding to -1. So this is a bug that we should fix. And we have 2 options sort of to fix it. One would be if you go from play to about to exit, and then you try and go down 1 more, you cycle back to the start. And if you're at play and you hit up, you cycle back to the end, which is what I want to implement. But you could also just say, if you press down at exit, don't actually subtract 1 if we're at the last element. So let's do the cycling. So here, we subtract 1 from our selected index, and then we want to do a check. Say, if the selected index has now become -1, so it's gone beyond the first element in our array, we want to take our selected index and push it to options.length -1. So we're saying now our selected index should be the last thing in the array. And we'll do the same thing here. Selected index, so we add 1. If our selected index is equal to options.length, so it's equal to 1 more than the last index, then our selected index should become 0. So let's run it, see? Fingers crossed. Yes, perfect. Okay, we have actually finished our menu. Our menu code is done. We can leave this alone, and we can switch over to game, and we can start building out this class so that we can make this a little prettier. We can demo how to create multiple menus to sort of simulate the fact that a game has multiple choices. So let's do that. Let's start with, I'm going to get rid of this commented out code. We don't need it anymore. And I want to refactor this a little bit to clean it up. So I'm going to create a private method here called run main menu. And into that, I am going to move all of our menu code here. And here we can run the main menu. I'm going to get rid of this code for press any key to exit. And I'm going to say, let's replace the title and say the paint drying the game. So this should show up in our title bar for our console. Whoops. There we go. And this menu, we could pretty it up a little bit by creating some title art for paint drying. So I'm going to flip over to my trusty text to ASCII generator, and I'm going to grab paint drying in the bloody font, select and copy, flip back here. I'm going to change the prompt to a verbatim string, which allows us to have multiple lines. I'm going to paste in our paint drying. You can say, welcome to the paint drying simulator. What would you like to do? And then let's also give them a little bit of instructions. Since this is the first time they're encountering a menu in our game, we should probably tell them how a menu works. So we could say, use the arrow keys to cycle through options and press enter to select an option. So we run, and then what we want to do is, based on the selected index, do something. So if the selected index is 0, that means we should kick off the game. If the selected index is 1, we should display an about screen. And if the selected index is 2, we should go ahead and exit the game. And to make this code clean, let's create a new method for each of those. So these will all be private. Private void exit game. Let's create private void display about info. And private void run, what should we call this? First choice. So this will be run the first choice in our game. So what we can do here is use a switch statement. for our selected index, and case 0, which would be play, we can do something, and then we have to make sure to have our break. 1, do something, make sure we have our break. 2, do something, make sure we have our break here. So here for 0, we'll go ahead and call our run first choice method. For 1, we'll call display about info. And for 2, we will exit game. And normally you do want to handle, this is like an else statement for every other case, but for us, I'm going to go ahead and delete it because we know it can only possibly be 0, 1, or 2, and we don't need to handle the other case. So we've got something set up. We've got these empty functions that should run, so we should probably fill them out. So let's create an exit game method where we say press any key to exit. We will wait for them to press a key, and then we can use the environment.exit method to exit our game. And environment.exit, we can look up the docs, but this essentially just terminates the application. And if you pass in a number that's not 0 into the exit code, that would indicate that our application crashed, and we're sort of specifying it crashed with this error. But if we pass in 0, that's by convention meaning that our application closed successfully. So this is one way that we can exit our console apps. So we've got our exit game method. Let's do some about info. I'm gonna just copy and paste to speed things up. So here's what I want for my about info. That it was created by me, that we used this text generator. It's coming soon to a console near you. Press any key to return to the menu, and then at the end we can run the main menu again. And then display first choice, what we can do here is let's just put a placeholder in, placeholder for first choice. And we can exit the game after the first choice. So let's run it. Let's see that it works. What we want to do is test each of these cases to make sure that they're all hooked up properly to our menu. So let's start with the about. Takes us to our about, takes us back to the main menu. Great. Let's try play. Placeholder for the first choice. Press any key to exit. And let's try it one more time with the exit. Press any key to exit. So it looks like we got those hooked up. And the last thing that I want to do is actually show you that this menu class, even though we used it for a main menu here, we could use it for any decision in our game. So if we had a shop that the player went to and you could purchase an item from the shop, we could use our menu to be able to do that. In this case, we're making a paint drying simulator. So we're going to create a prompt about what color paint you'd like to watch dry. And our options, let's choose a couple of colors here. We've got red, we've got green, blue, and our class has been set up so that it can handle as many options as we give it. So why not add a fourth option here, yellow. We'll create a new menu, call it our color menu. It's equal to a new menu, passing in our prompt and our options. And then we can get the selected index by running that menu. So we'll have an integer, which we can use our switch statement again to figure out what we want to do with the choice. So selected index. And we have 4 options. So 0 would be red, case 0, break. And we're going to have case 1, case 2, case 3. And for this, since this is just a demo, what we can do is display some colored text for each of these options. That is like, here is your riveting red paint drying. And we'll display it in red for when they choose 0. And we'll do the same thing, but in green when they choose 1. So let's change the background color for all of these to be console color.white, and then we can change the foreground color here to match our console color for whatever they've chosen. Here it's red, right line. Here is some riveting red paint drying for you. And we're just going to repeat this process for each of these branches. So instead of red, this is our green, this is our blue, this is our yellow. And since we're mucking with the foreground and background color, after we're done here, we can use the console class's reset color to set things back to their default. And before we exit the game, let's just let the player know, like, that's all for this game demo. So now we should have our main menu here, our title menu, that if you hit play, takes you to a new menu, a new choice, and we can choose what colored paint to watch dry. So let's play our game, and let's choose some green paint. We can see some green paint. That's all for the game demo. Press any key to exit, and let's test it again to make sure our other options are working. So I'm going to play. Let's try some blue paint this time. Looks like it's all working. So to recap, we created this reusable menu class, and since you're making choose your own adventure games where choices are fundamental to them, this is actually like a central piece of your game that you could build upon and extend and use for every place in your game where you had a decision. And that would make an improved interface over the things that we've made previously, where you had to like type in a number or a letter to select what you wanted to do in the game. And the way that we did it was we learned some more, we flexed our documentation reading skills to figure out how we can use read key to figure out what key was pressed. And then we had this logic that we learned how to do where we will actually clear the screen and re-render the menu using the selected index to change the styling so that the player gets some feedback about what's currently selected. And we learned how to detect the enter key so that we could then say the menu is closed. Here is what the player chose. One little caveat here is that this isn't the only way to do it in a console app. If you really want to get deep into the console, you can do this same menu structure without running clear on the whole screen. So I'll leave that as an advanced challenge to those of you who are interested, but throwing it out there that it's possible. And leave you with a final thought of, go forth, make your menus, use this structure, build reusable classes that help you make your game more easily.